Consider this mathematical curiosity. The more uncertain we become about proving God's existence through pure reason, the more certain our faith becomes through practical necessity. This appears contradictory until you apply probability theory to the human condition. In my years developing the mathematics of uncertainty and risk, I discovered something extraordinary, that uncertainty itself becomes the strongest foundation for religious commitment. Most people flee from doubt, treating it as faith's enemy. But what if I told you that methodical doubt, when properly applied, actually leads to more rational faith than naive certainty ever could? Today we'll explore why the impossibility of absolute proof makes the wager of faith not just reasonable, but mathematically inevitable. We'll discover how acknowledging the limits of human reason paradoxically strengthens rather than weakens our commitment to divine truth. This isn't about abandoning intellectual rigor, it's about applying that rigor so thoroughly that we reach a deeper certainty than reason alone could provide. Chapter 1: The Mathematics of Incomplete Information. In mathematics, we constantly work with incomplete information. When I developed probability theory with Fermat, we weren't dealing with certainties but with calculated risks based on partial knowledge. The gambler doesn't know which cards will come next, yet he must decide whether to bet. This same principle applies to life's ultimate questions. The error most people make is assuming that uncertainty equals ignorance. But mathematically, uncertainty is information. It tells us something precise about the limits of our knowledge and the nature of the problem we're solving. When we say we cannot prove God's existence with mathematical certainty, we're not admitting defeat, we're accurately describing the type of question we're addressing. Consider how we handle uncertainty in scientific method. We don't abandon experimentation because we can't achieve absolute certainty. Instead, we develop sophisticated methods for making reliable decisions under uncertainty. We calculate confidence intervals, assess risks, and make practical choices based on probability rather than certainty. The same rigor applies to religious questions. The fact that we cannot demonstrate God's existence like a geometric theorem doesn't make faith irrational. It makes faith a different type of rational response to a different type of evidence. When dealing with questions that transcend the material realm, we need decision-making methods appropriate to transcendent realities. This is where most atheistic arguments fail. They demand that spiritual reality submit to methods designed for material phenomena. It's like insisting that music be evaluated purely as physics equations. The mathematics of sound waves can describe music's physical properties, but cannot capture its meaning or beauty. Similarly, empirical methods can examine religion's material effects but cannot directly access spiritual truth. The mathematician learns to respect different types of problems requiring different approaches. Some questions yield to deductive proof, others to empirical testing, still others to probability analysis. The question of God's existence belongs to this third category, not because it's less important, but because it's more comprehensive than questions answerable through limited human methods. Uncertainty about ultimate questions isn't a bug in human reasoning, it's a feature. It forces us to develop more sophisticated decision-making capabilities than simple logical proof could provide. Chapter 2: Why Absolute Proof Would Destroy Faith. Here's a counterintuitive insight from my studies of human nature. If God's existence could be proven with mathematical certainty, genuine faith would become impossible, and human freedom would be destroyed. This isn't a limitation of divine power, it's a necessary condition for meaningful relationship between finite and infinite beings. Consider what happens when we face overwhelming evidence for something. If someone points a loaded gun at your head, you don't freely choose to fear for your life. Fear becomes an involuntary response to undeniable reality. Similarly, if God's existence were mathematically demonstrable, belief would become compulsory rather than voluntary. But relationships require freedom to be meaningful. A programmed robot cannot love, because love requires the possibility of choosing otherwise. If God's existence were undeniable, our response would be mere intellectual acknowledgement, not the personal commitment that characterizes genuine faith. This explains why the evidence for God's existence is compelling but not coercive. There's enough evidence to make belief reasonable, but enough uncertainty to preserve human freedom. The mathematical elegance of natural laws, the fine-tuning of physical constants, the emergence of consciousness, the universality of moral intuition, these provide strong probabilistic evidence without destroying the possibility of doubt. Think about human relationships. The strongest bonds form not when love is forced by overwhelming evidence, but when it's freely chosen despite uncertainty. A spouse who loves you because undeniable proof compels that love isn't really loving you at all. But a spouse who chooses to love you despite uncertainties about the future demonstrates genuine commitment. The divine-human relationship follows the same pattern. God provides enough evidence to make faith reasonable while maintaining enough hiddenness to keep faith free. This isn't divine shyness, it's divine wisdom about the conditions necessary for authentic relationship. Furthermore, absolute proof would eliminate the moral and spiritual development that comes through wrestling with ultimate questions. The struggle with doubt, the gradual deepening of trust, the growth in spiritual maturity, all of this would be impossible if belief were as involuntary as accepting that 2 + 2 = 4. The mathematical mind appreciates elegant solutions to complex problems. The combination of sufficient evidence with preserved freedom represents an elegant solution to the problem of how infinite being can relate meaningfully to finite persons. Uncertainty isn't God's failure to provide adequate proof, it's God's wisdom in creating conditions for genuine relationship. Chapter 3: The Practical Mathematics of Decision-Making. When facing decisions under uncertainty, mathematicians use expected value calculations, weighing potential outcomes by their probability and significance. Applied to religious questions, this mathematical approach reveals why faith becomes not just reasonable but practically inevitable for any thinking person. Consider the basic structure of Pascal's wager. If God exists and we believe, we gain infinite happiness. If God exists and we don't believe, we forfeit infinite happiness. If God doesn't exist, the practical difference between belief and unbelief is finite at most. Even if the probability of God's existence is quite small, the infinite value of the potential outcome makes belief the only rational choice. Critics often misunderstand this argument, thinking it reduces faith to mere calculation. But that misses the point. The wager isn't designed to create faith through mathematical proof, it's designed to show that faith is mathematically reasonable even for someone who begins with skepticism. The mathematics here reveals something profound about human decision-making. We constantly make choices based on incomplete information and uncertain outcomes. The businessman who invests in a new venture, the scientist who pursues a research hypothesis, the couple who decides to marry, all are making calculated bets on uncertain futures. Why should decisions about ultimate reality be held to a different standard? If anything, such decisions deserve more careful analysis because their potential consequences are more significant. The person who demands absolute certainty before committing to anything important would be paralyzed into complete inaction. But the wager goes deeper than simple cost-benefit analysis. It reveals that neutrality on ultimate questions is mathematically impossible. The person who claims to withhold judgment about God's existence is actually betting that either God doesn't exist or that God doesn't care about human belief. This is itself a wager with significant potential consequences. Moreover, the mathematical framework helps us see that faith involves the same type of reasoning we use successfully in every other area of life. We assess available evidence, consider potential outcomes, account for our uncertainty, and make the best decision we can with the information we have. The religious skeptic who demands a different decision-making process for spiritual questions is actually being inconsistent with their own rational methodology. The beauty of this approach is that it doesn't require abandoning intellectual honesty. You can acknowledge uncertainty about God's existence while recognizing that practical life requires making decisions despite that uncertainty. The mathematics of expected value provides a rational framework for navigating this unavoidable human situation. Chapter 4: The Experimental Method Applied to Spiritual Realities. As someone who contributed to the development of scientific method through my work on atmospheric pressure and vacuum experiments, I understand the power of empirical testing. But I also learned that different types of reality require different experimental approaches. Spiritual realities can be tested empirically, just not through the same methods we use for material phenomena. The scientific method involves forming hypotheses, designing experiments, gathering data, and drawing conclusions. This same methodological rigor can be applied to religious questions, but the experiments must be appropriate to the subject matter. You can't test spiritual claims using only material instruments, just as you can't test mathematical theorems using only physical experiments. Consider how we might experimentally test the hypothesis that prayer has real effects. The experiment involves actually praying consistently over time and carefully observing the results, not just external changes in circumstances, but internal changes in perspective, peace, wisdom, and moral capacity. The data include subjective experiences, but subjective experience is still empirical data when properly documented and analyzed. The skeptic who rejects such evidence because it includes subjective elements is being unscientific. We routinely accept subjective reports in medicine, psychology, and social science. The patient's reported pain levels are considered valid data even though pain cannot be directly measured by external instruments. Similarly, spiritual experiences provide legitimate empirical data about spiritual realities. Furthermore, the experimental approach to faith yields reproducible results. Throughout history, people who have seriously experimented with prayer, meditation, moral discipline, and spiritual practice report remarkably consistent findings. They describe experiences of transcendence, inner peace, moral transformation, and relationship with divine reality. The consistency of these reports across cultures and centuries provides strong empirical evidence. The experimental method also reveals that spiritual investigation requires proper preparation and methodology. Just as you can't observe cellular structures without learning to use a microscope properly, you can't observe spiritual realities without developing appropriate spiritual sensitivities. This isn't circular reasoning. It's acknowledging that different types of investigation require different types of preparation. The mathematical mind appreciates that experimental results must be interpreted within appropriate theoretical frameworks. The same applies to spiritual experimentation. The person who experiments with prayer within a materialistic framework that denies the possibility of spiritual reality is like a scientist who experiments with light while denying the possibility that electromagnetic radiation exists. Properly conducted spiritual experimentation combines the rigor of scientific method with openness to realities that transcend material measurement. This isn't abandoning empiricism, it's extending empiricism to its logical conclusion. Chapter 5: The Geometry of the Human Heart. Mathematics taught me to appreciate different types of space and different geometries. Just as we need non-Euclidean geometry to describe curved space, we need different conceptual tools to map the landscape of human desire and spiritual need. The heart has its own geometry, and understanding this geometry reveals why faith addresses aspects of human nature that reason alone cannot reach. Consider the mathematical concept of infinity. We can work with infinity mathematically, but we cannot fully comprehend it. Similarly, the human heart is oriented toward realities that exceed finite understanding, infinite love, ultimate meaning, perfect justice, absolute beauty. These aren't mere psychological projections, they're data about human nature that must be accounted for in any complete anthropology. The geometry of desire reveals something crucial about human beings. We are the only creatures who are systematically dissatisfied with finite goods. Animals seek food, shelter, reproduction, and safety, finite goals that can be achieved within natural systems. But humans uniquely seek meaning, purpose, ultimate truth, perfect love, and eternal significance. These infinite aspirations cannot be satisfied by finite objects. This creates what I call the human paradox. We are finite beings with infinite longings. Our reason can analyze finite objects and relations, but our deepest needs point beyond reason's domain. This isn't a design flaw, it's evidence that we are made for relationship with infinite reality. The mathematical mind recognizes that when you have data that doesn't fit your current model, you need to expand the model rather than ignore the data. The persistent human orientation toward transcendent reality suggests that purely materialistic models of human nature are incomplete. We need frameworks that can account for both our rational capacities and our spiritual aspirations. Furthermore, the geometry of the heart reveals why purely rational approaches to life leave people feeling empty. Reason is a powerful tool for analyzing and manipulating finite realities, but it cannot provide ultimate meaning or purpose. These come from our relationship to realities that transcend the material realm. This explains why the most intellectually sophisticated societies often struggle with depression, anxiety, and existential meaninglessness. Developing reason while neglecting the heart creates internal contradiction. It's like trying to navigate three-dimensional space using only two-dimensional maps. You can get somewhere, but you'll constantly feel lost. The integration of faith and reason resolves this contradiction by acknowledging that both are necessary for complete human functioning. Reason analyzes the mechanics of reality, faith connects us to reality's meaning and purpose. Neither is sufficient alone, but together they provide the tools necessary for human flourishing. Understanding the heart's geometry also explains why spiritual practice feels natural to most people throughout history, while philosophical materialism requires constant argument and reinforcement. We're naturally oriented toward transcendence because that's how we're designed. Chapter 6: The Probability Cascade of Christian Evidence. When you apply probability theory systematically to Christian claims, something remarkable emerges, a cascade of cumulative evidence that makes faith not just reasonable but mathematically compelling. Each piece of evidence may seem modest in isolation, but together they create overwhelming probability for Christian truth. Start with the fine-tuning of physical constants. The probability that universal constants would fall within the narrow ranges necessary for complex chemistry, stellar formation, and planetary systems is astronomically small, perhaps 1 in 10 to the power of 120 or smaller. While this doesn't prove theism definitively, it dramatically shifts the probability landscape in favor of intelligent design over random chance. Add the emergence of life from non-living matter. Despite decades of research, we have no adequate natural explanation for how complex biological information systems could arise spontaneously. The probability calculations for even simple proteins forming by chance exceed the probabilistic resources of the entire universe. Again, each individual calculation might be disputed, but the cumulative case grows stronger. Consider the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection. Historians widely accept that Jesus died by crucifixion, that his tomb was found empty, that multiple groups of people claimed to see him alive afterward, and that these claims were so convincing they transformed frightened disciples into bold evangelists willing to die for their testimony. While each fact might have alternative explanations, the combination becomes increasingly difficult to explain naturalistically. Examine the predictive power of Christian moral insights. Christian ethical frameworks have consistently anticipated discoveries in psychology, sociology, and human development. The emphasis on forgiveness correlates with better mental health outcomes. The focus on stable marriage relationships aligns with optimal child development research. The concern for the poor reflects economic insights about social stability. Analyze the transformational effects of Christian faith. Throughout history, genuine Christian conversion has consistently produced positive changes in individual behavior, family stability, and social reform. The probability that a false belief system would systematically generate beneficial outcomes across diverse cultures and time periods becomes increasingly unlikely. Consider the philosophical coherence of Christian theism. Unlike naturalistic worldviews that struggle to account for consciousness, moral objectivity, rational reliability, and existential meaning, theism provides elegant explanations for these universal human experiences. The probability that reality would systematically appear designed for beings like us increases if we actually are designed. Each line of evidence operates independently, but they converge toward the same conclusion. Using Bayesian analysis, we can see that multiple independent lines of evidence compound their individual probabilities. Even if each piece of evidence only modestly favors theism, the cumulative case becomes overwhelming. The mathematical mind appreciates that this isn't about achieving absolute certainty, it's about making rational decisions based on the best available evidence. In every other area of life, we act on probabilities far less compelling than the cumulative case for Christianity provides. The skeptic who demands absolute proof for religious claims while accepting much weaker evidence for their naturalistic assumptions is applying inconsistent evidential standards. Rational decision-making requires proportioning belief to evidence, and the evidence cascade for Christianity meets or exceeds the standards we use for other important life decisions. Chapter 7: The Logic of Surrendering Logic's Supremacy. The deepest paradox in my philosophical journey was discovering that the highest use of reason is recognizing reason's limitations and pointing beyond itself to realities that transcend purely rational analysis. This isn't anti-intellectual, it's the ultimate intellectual honesty about the scope and proper function of human rational capacity. Throughout my mathematical work, I learned that every logical system depends on axioms that cannot be proven within the system itself. Euclidean geometry rests on postulates that must be accepted as given. Arithmetic depends on basic number concepts that cannot be derived from more fundamental principles. Even the most rigorous logical systems require foundational assumptions that lie outside logical proof. This mathematical insight applies to all human knowledge. Our rational faculties themselves depend on assumptions that cannot be rationally justified without circular reasoning. We assume that our senses provide reliable information about external reality, that our logical intuitions correspond to actual logical relations, that the future will resemble the past enough for inductive reasoning to work. These assumptions are necessary for reasoning to function, but they cannot be proven through reasoning alone. The person who insists that everything must be rationally proven before being accepted is caught in an impossible situation. Their own rationalism depends on unprovable assumptions about reason's reliability and scope. They are living by faith in reason while claiming to live by reason alone. Recognizing this doesn't lead to irrationalism or relativism. Instead, it leads to a more sophisticated understanding of how different types of knowledge work together. Reason is a powerful tool for analyzing relationships between concepts and evidence, but it cannot establish its own foundations or validate its own scope. These come from sources that transcend reason while being compatible with reason. This is where faith enters not as reason's enemy but as reason's necessary foundation and completion. Faith provides the foundational assumptions that make reasoning possible: trust in reality's intelligibility, confidence in logical principles, hope that truth is accessible to human investigation. Without these faith commitments, reasoning could not function at all. Furthermore, when reason operates at the limits of its capacity, addressing questions about ultimate reality, meaning, and purpose, it naturally points beyond itself to realities that exceed finite comprehension. The mathematician who studies infinity appreciates realities that cannot be fully grasped but can be meaningfully engaged. Similarly, the philosopher who studies ultimate questions encounters realities that cannot be exhaustively analyzed but can be genuinely known through relationship. The logic of surrendering logic's supremacy is therefore not abandoning logic but using logic so rigorously that we recognize where logic must yield to other ways of knowing. This includes direct experiential knowledge, moral intuition, aesthetic appreciation, and spiritual awareness. Each provides legitimate access to aspects of reality that pure logical analysis cannot reach. The mature thinker learns to use different cognitive tools for different types of investigation, just as the mature craftsman uses different physical tools for different types of work. Reason excels at analyzing finite relationships and testing logical consistency. Faith excels at connecting us to infinite realities and ultimate meanings. Wisdom lies not in using only one tool but in knowing when and how to use each appropriately. This integration of reason and faith creates a more complete and satisfying approach to life's deepest questions than either rationalism or fideism could provide alone. Conclusion. The mathematics of uncertainty reveals a profound truth. Acknowledging the limits of human knowledge doesn't weaken our capacity for confident action. It strengthens it by forcing us to develop more sophisticated decision-making methods. The person who waits for absolute certainty before committing to anything important will spend their entire life in paralyzed indecision. Faith emerges not as reason's failure but as reason's fulfillment, the natural response of rational beings who understand both the power and the limitations of rational analysis. When we apply the same mathematical rigor to spiritual questions that we use for practical decisions, faith becomes not just permissible but rationally compelling. The experimental approach to spiritual reality yields consistent results across cultures and centuries. Those who seriously investigate divine reality through prayer, moral discipline, and spiritual practice discover a realm of meaning and purpose that transforms their understanding of everything else. This isn't wishful thinking, it's empirical data that any honest investigator can verify through personal experimentation. The ultimate paradox resolves into elegant synthesis. Uncertainty about proving God's existence makes space for the freely chosen relationship that constitutes genuine faith. The mathematician in me appreciates the beautiful logic by which infinite reality makes itself known to finite beings, not through overwhelming proof that would destroy freedom, but through sufficient evidence that makes faith both reasonable and transformative.